everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn today. I'm so excited to get started. We are going to dive into the topic of how to treat employees as thoughtfully as customers. It's a really fascinating topic because it really dives into this notion of like, okay, great. We really care about our customers. We got to do everything for the customers. I know Jeff Bezos has even come out and said, we got to treat our customers like as if they're the end all be all and, give them crazy, less than 24-hour delivery times. But at the end of the day, what we sometimes neglect is how do we treat our people? And ultimately, if we can treat our people right, that can help us deliver the outcomes we want to deliver for our customers. Because ultimately, if our people aren't treated right, they're not going to pass through those great outcomes to the customers that we're trying to serve. So we've got an incredible guest speaker with us today. We've got Diana Dosik. Diana is a partner at Boston Consulting Group, and she's given a great TED Talk speaker. She's given a great TED Talk speech on this topic. Diana, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So I love to dive into this notion of how to treat employees as thoughtfully as customers. I guess one way of kicking this off, actually, because some of our colleagues may not have actually seen the TED Talk or just seen your background. I know I gave a brief overview of you, but do you mind maybe just giving a little background as to how you started getting interested into this topic in the first place?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm at the Boston Consulting Group. We work with a lot of large companies on some of their biggest strategic challenges. And I was really drawn pretty early in my career to the people side of those challenges. The phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast, even as a strategy consultant, really spoke to me. And so I've spent a lot of my career working on the people and organization and culture side of work challenges. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time on is how people get the best out of their teams. We talk a lot about talent, and you can have so many talented people in a space, but it's how you get them to work together, to work productively, to overcome challenges together that really makes the difference. And so I started spending more and more time focused on how companies can get that high performance culture and get that flywheel happening, and also seeing what a lot of the stumbling blocks were. And so that really informed a lot of the work that I got to do. And it was always very satisfying because so many people are miserable at work. You see all the studies, and it's just a real shame to think that we have all this incredible talent and that people are having these dissatisfying and rating experiences at work.
That's interesting. I think the big thing, though, that I want to point out is this notion that bad managers are not intentionally bad managers. I think that's like a big aha moment. I see so often on LinkedIn, people post about, oh, my manager sucks, or my leader is awful, or, this person is sabotaging me, or this and that, and all those sorts of things. And I think when you think about it, are they really trying to make your life miserable, or is there some potential intention that they've got behind their action that could potentially be positive, but you are not seeing it because it's negatively affecting you in the moment? How do you go about really, how do you go about seeing people for their intentions and not just on your perceptions?
It's a great question. And I think there's sort of an individual answer, and then there's kind of a project level answer. As an individual, I think I always say, assume good intent. Always assume good intent as the starting point, because that unruffles a lot of feathers right off the back. And then if you have something that's still, I'm assuming good intent, but something still really isn't working here, then you can walk into that conversation, but you still walk into that conversation with an empathetic starting point, with a, you may not realize this, but I'm, experiencing you in this way. What am I missing? It's a much more productive conversation than, you're a real jerk and I don't want to be here anymore. So there, on an individual level, there's a lot of just that remember compassion sort of self-training that you have to do. Assume good intent, remember compassion. Everyone's lives are complicated. And I think the pandemic actually helped with that a little bit, seeing into people's homes, having a little bit more intimacy, just a reminder that most people are human and trying to do their best. But on a project level, there really is an opportunity to more objectively assess what's happening in a culture, and to do it in a way that takes all the blame out of it. I think part of why myself and my teams are very successful is that we are working with C-suites and big companies, and we never level blame. It's a very neutral description, and it actually sets a really high bar for describing what's going on. Our bar is that we should be able to describe the situation such that everyone in the situation would agree that that is what's happening, which means that it is very fact-based, it is very inarguable, and it shows kind of the logical links that no one can disagree with. Because this X incentive exists, these people are focusing on X and they are ignoring Y. When they ignore Y, these other people, miss their deadline. And that's why, this breakdown happens. And before we come in, people are saying things like, those people are terrible and they're really inconsiderate and they're always late. And these people are saying, those people are always whining and don't they realize they're not the priority? You lay it out neutrally and everyone can look at it and say, yep, that's right. That is what's happening. And then you can have a much more productive conversation about, okay, so maybe we shouldn't make the incentives for group X so strong because they really should be focusing more on group Y or the opposite. So it's really helpful to lay out the facts in a very neutral way. And when everyone can get on board with what's actually happening, that's when you can start to fix it.
How do you go? Is there like a framework that you use for that? I feel like this is really interesting because it sounds a lot like, I'm a big fan of Dr. Marshall Rosenberg's Keys to Nonviolent Communication, where he talks about like observation, feeling, need, request. And one of like the first thing, observation, is like when I am about to convey to somebody that I am frustrated with them, the observation is an undeniable fact. So I love that that's what you had laid it out. But one of the bigger things that I'll often hear as like a great kind of template for how to get buy-in from people is to incorporate them in the decision-making process. So to say like, hey, Jenny, we're going to get the entire, team together. We're going to talk about how we should move forward for this project. So then there's consensus and people understand why. But eventually when your team gets so big, when you get so many people within the organization, eventually this message just needs to be passed down because you can't incorporate everybody into that decision-making process. But it can also be very difficult to get that buy-in from people if they weren't part of the decision-making process. I mean, I love the way that you laid it out in a very like objective, like this is why this is happening. But is there like, how do you come to that consensus, and how do you get consensus even when people disagree?
Yeah. So in our work as consultants, we do have a great advantage, which is that we are a third party and we are neutral. So we are able to interview people and get really, open discussion about what people say is going on. And we're also able to follow people through a day or two. We get a lot of access. And so that helps us really paint this neutral picture of what's going on because we can see and we can come at it from a neutral lens. We don't have a stake in the game that people are playing. So that's a big part in terms of getting access. In terms of the mental framework, there's this notion, and I think it was Herbert Simon who talked about, bounded rationality. Humans are rational within bounds, and we all know that we're emotional and have a lot of other things going on. But if you go in with the assumption that there is a rationale for this behavior, someone is not trying to be a jerk, someone is not trying to ruin someone's day, but there is a reason, and a good reason in their mind, at least, for what they're doing, then a lot of the work is just trying to unearth what that reason is. And often what we find is that leaders have set up many incentive systems that they don't really know exist. Maybe they're byproducts of something that they created. For example, we worked in a pharma company and they had an incentive for people who were developing early molecules, that the number of early molecules that made it to the next stage was a key component of how people were rewarded. And that kind of makes sense. And in some cultures with other things going on, that might have been a non-issue. But in this culture, with some of the other factors that I won't go into, it meant that the teams developing the early molecules were just pushing things over the line, even if they were kind of half-baked, even if they weren't doing all the work up front. It became much more important to just get something into the next stage. And if it failed there, fine, but much better to at least get it to that stage than to have it fail in the beginning. And that was causing a lot of drama, because then the people who would inherit these not fully baked things were really frustrated. They felt like, they hadn't been gotten the package that they were supposed to get. And then they were having to go back and do a lot of work. And the company was wasting a ton of money and time and losing great talent who didn't want to be there anymore. But it was really hard for them to see through all the layers of communication and incentives that this was a real problem. And so if you if you look at your organization with this view of, one, people are rational and they're trying their best. So whatever they're doing, you've created an environment that's making that the rational choice in their mind. And then you can really study it. I joke it sometimes, like Jane Goodall and the apes. You have to just study it and say, okay, this is a system. And why is this system working this way? And then how can I intervene to fix it?
I am fascinated by incentives. I think incentives, subtle incentives, are so interesting because I think we do things as leaders. We create processes, we create standard operating procedures, and we don't realize the ramifications of those processes or procedures we create because we think we're incentivizing one thing, but in reality, we're completely incentivizing another. One example I can think of is I was recently reading about this, but in Britain, when England took over India, when they first arrived in India, all the British soldiers were like, hey, there are a ton of cobras here. We need to get rid of these cobras. So any person that brings us a cobra head, we will give you money to essentially show us that you brought us this cobra head, because ultimately we want to get rid of the cobras because they're really scary and they're poisoning people and they're killing people. And what ended up happening was people just started creating cobra farms. They just kept breeding cobras into these farms and just bringing them their heads and be like, here's a cobra head, give me some money. And they're like, okay, great. And then British were like, okay, we've discovered there's way too many cobra farms. No more incentives for the cobra heads. And they're like, okay, fine. And they released all the cobras to the wild. So now there are more cobras in the wild because the British soldiers tried to incentivize getting rid of the cobras. In reality, it didn't work the way they wanted it to. So the question I have for you is, how can we go about auditing our processes and procedures, and how can we go about communicating effectively to our team members who maybe have grown accustomed to this new process or procedure and really, really like it and do not like change, that, hey, this is not working the way I wanted it to, and we need to change it up and switch it?
Yeah. I love that story, by the way, because that's a perfect example of what we see in companies. Only the complexity is that it's that layered and layered and layered. It's not just one incentive, it's a mix of all kinds of things between how people get paid, how people get promoted, which might be different than, an annual bonus versus career trajectory, what people try to accomplish in other ways in the organization. There are so many incentives at play that it can be tricky to tease them apart and understand what the big ones really are. We had a client and we looked at their scorecard. This is how we evaluate managers. And they had 18 KPIs on the list. And we said, okay, so how does this factor into their pay? And they showed us how it factors into their compensation. And there were some of these KPIs that accounted for like 0.02% of somebody's compensation, and something else that accounted for maybe 50. And it's like, okay, you could have this list of things, but this is just a distraction. This is not having any impact at all. All that's driving the behavior, because we're simple animals at the end of the day. We can't optimize for 18 things. So we're going to pick the one or two big things and we're going to drive hard at that. And so in terms of how you have to address this, it's really about setting up, and sometimes it's using a third party, but in any way that you can get that open and honest communication about what is driving behavior is the first thing. But I will tell you, a lot of people can't even self-report this. And I'll give you an example. So we did some work where you had two people that you were interested in. You have a hairstylist, and you have, the shampoo person who sort of washes your hair before you see the stylist. And you notice, okay, so the person who washes somebody's hair really doesn't talk to the person that much. It's a very quiet experience. And you ask them why, and they say, because I respect the customer. The customer has had a long day. It's really busy. This is like a quiet, reflective time. And then the person moves to the hairstylist chair, and the hairstylist is chatting away and they have this long conversation. You talk to them afterwards. I noticed you were talking a lot, because I respect the customer. They're coming to me where we have this relationship. That's such an important thing. So same stated rationale, exact opposite behavior. And so people don't always even know how to articulate why they're behaving the way they're behaving or what's driving it. So some of it is asking people, but some of it is that observation and kind of seeing what the incentives might be at play. So for example, in that situation, you do more digging, you find out what's going on. You also notice, by the way, so some people say, oh, well, maybe shampooists are shy by nature. We hire shy people for that, and we hire outgoing people for hairstylists. But then you realize that it's a career path. The shampoo person 5 years from then is the hairstylist. So did a shy person suddenly become a preternaturally chatty person? So that's what I mean about this idea that the context, that the environment you create has powerful incentives for behavior. And it turns out that the hairstylist makes money based off of relationships. And so it's really important that they talk and that they create a relationship with the customer. The modern situation that where nowadays people have phones all the time is a huge problem for hairstylists, because a lot of people just are checking out now instead of having a conversation. And it's an issue for business. So that's a relationship business. The shampoo person is an aspiring hairstylist, and it's an apprenticeship style model. So they want the approval of the hairstylist. They want the hairstylist to bring them along with them. And so you are not going to interrupt their relationship with the customer. They own the relationship. If you start talking, that hairstylist is going to give you a look like, stop talking. You're the quiet person. I run the show here. So it just is an example of this. Often we attribute things to personality. Oh, that person's shy, or that person's outgoing, or we attribute it to, what they say it is. Oh, they say that it's out of respect. Okay, so this is a respect issue. But it was neither of those things. It was a very concrete, this is how this industry works, and this is what it pays to do in my situation. So I think you have to bring that view of context. What context am I putting people into? What resources am I giving them? What constraints am I putting on them? And what goals am I asking them to achieve? And therefore, like, what ends up being kind of the logical output in terms of their behavior. And the benefit of that is not only that it's accurate, but it takes the emotion out of it. You stop blaming someone. You're like, okay, I understand why you were doing this behavior that was really upsetting to me. I didn't realize that I had set this goal in front of your face, but I had put these constraints on you. And that was making, whatever behavior I'm seeing kind of a natural consequence. Okay, now I can forgive you for that, and we can both move on. We can change the context, and we can change the situation.
So how can we go about, obviously back to the topic, like how can we go about treating employees as thoughtfully as customers? What can leaders start to do to be more conscientiously and empathetically aware of the situations that their people are facing? Because I feel like so often, we think as leaders, we know what's going on with our people. And back to LinkedIn, like I'll see a lot of leaders be like, if I didn't know what was going on with my leader, you should fire me on the spot because I must be a crappy manager. And it's like, well, you're not a mind reader. I'm not expecting you to be a soothsayer, but you can't possibly expect to know everything going on with your people's minds. But how can we become more conscientiously aware of this? And
Yeah.
by the way, for those people that think like, oh, if I don't know what's going on with my people's like emotional state and everything going on with them, then I'm a bad leader. It's like, does that mean you're literally talking to them about their personal stuff all the time and you're not actually focused on the tasks that need to get done? I think there's just so many factors at play for being a good leader, and so many balls to juggle. How can we go about being empathetic and like the right amount of empathy, the right amount of understanding of what's going on, the right amount of like, hey, we need to also get these things done, and like put them all together? I'm not saying they're competing. They're only just, I guess, competing for mental space and time.
Right. Right. Well, I think, and this is a great segue into what I talk about in the TED Talk, one of the things that I noticed when I started really working with leaders on this idea of how do you shape the context so that people, that what's rational for the individual is also what's good for the company, so that you don't have to be constantly managing it, right? You want to put these incentives in place so that you have a coherency that drives people to the actions you want them to be driven to without you having to personally do it all the time. And what the insight that I shared in the talk is that you actually have in your own organization people who are really skilled at doing this, and they're in your marketing team because they are the people who are focused on the customer. So they are doing this work about what does the customer tend to like and not like? What environment do they need to be in? If you look at the design of an Apple store, it's incredibly thoughtfully designed. Everything from how do I make it easy to see the product? How do I make it easy to check out? They went from a traditional checkout station to people walking around with those little checkout pads so that you never have to stand in line. And it's all with this idea of, okay, I want people to buy stuff. How do I make it as easy and appealing as possible to buy stuff? And your marketing team knows how to do that. So you really just need to translate that skill internally and pay that same attention to your people. What am I trying to get people to do this year? What are the big goals? What are the big rocks? What does our team need to accomplish? Okay, what am I doing to design their environment so that focusing on my goal is the easy, rational choice? And that's everything from positive, incentives to achieve the goal. It's dampening things that would constrain the goal. It's avoiding any roadblocks or distractions that would make, achieving that goal secondary to something else. So it's being thoughtful about designing that context so that you don't have to fight fires all the time and ask about people's emotional states every day, because you've created an environment that 80% of the time puts them in the headspace you want them to be in, has them focused on the tasks you want them to focus on. And then you are dealing as a manager with the edge cases and with maintaining this system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. That's really interesting. So is there a cadence that you suggest the marketing team focus internally towards the employees? Is like one day a week, or is it one day a month, or is it like whole weeks? Like, is it better to have like in-depth time periods? So maybe like 1 week every month, the whole marketing team's focused on internal employee experience, or is it one day a week, or is it one day every couple? Like, what is the right cadence for allocating that time for our marketing team? Because to the whole point about creating procedures and processes, we want to be able to incentivize, like, hey, this one day or whatever time period we are, it's just on this. So anything that's got to do with our customers, throw it out. We're doing it tomorrow. We're going to do it next week.
Yeah. So, and perhaps I wasn't clear about this. I wouldn't recommend having the marketing team focus internally per se. It's more that there's a skill set that marketers tend to have developed, that when I look at the skill set that actually managers need, there's a lot of cross-pollination that needs to happen. So I'm more suggesting that we tap into that mindset and that skill set. And perhaps there is some actual training that they do for managers, but it's really the managers and the people on the line that just need to have more of that mindset about their people, which is, okay, these are human beings working in a context. Part of my job is to shape that context so that their behavior ends up being what I need it to be. And so it's more of a skill set translation than actually the marketing team should be in charge of, driving this, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it also may not be a bad idea to even attempt that, even as like an initial trial. I know some of our leaders might be thinking like, hey, I got a marketing team and they're constantly focused on the customer, but I think maybe I could devote a little bit of their time just to start coming up with ideas for how they can serve the employees. But I don't know, that was just an idea.
Yeah. Well, I think there is certainly value in, we bring a third party neutrality. And so I do think if for no other reason than if you have people in another part of an organization who have a certain skill set and then can do some of this unearthing, that can be helpful, because it is tricky as a very senior leader to do it on your own. If you are, the head of research and development, back to my initial example, and you ask, the head of product in the first phase, like, what's going on here? there's every incentive in that, especially in that organization, to say everything's great. We're all working really hard. We're doing the best that we can. Like, it's very difficult to get good answers sometimes from your own people. So it can be useful to have um, a neutral party that can help you kind of sift through this. Um, it also helps to come up through the organization. So people who have started out junior and become senior can sometimes tap into this well, because they remember what it was like in those positions. They're like, you know what, I have to admit, now that I'm here, when I was there, I looked for the easy project at X time because it's really important to get promoted in the first 2 years, whatever it is. There's always an undercurrent. There's always some game you didn't even realize you would set up that people are playing. And so the sooner you can find out what that is and shape it productively, the faster you can get rid of the distraction.
That's true. I don't know. I don't know if that always manifests itself the way it's supposed to be manifested, because sometimes, to your point about incentives, you'll see people come up through the ranks. I almost kind of think about it like a fraternity or something like that. It's like, as a freshman, you're hazed and you go through hell and it sucks. And you're like, I would never do this to another person. This is awful. I can't believe it. And then as you're a sophomore, you're not a freshman anymore. Like, oh, we're totally hazing the freshmen. Of course I would do that. I had to go through that myself. If they don't go through this much pain, I mean, how the heck do they get to earn their rite of passage?
Yeah.
I'm not characterizing all fraternities like that, but I'm just saying it's this notion of the pain that I went through to get to this point, someone else should have to go through because they want to aspire to get to my level in the organization. And sometimes I feel like that level of empathy is lost because they just don't get it.
No, you're right. They're in the best position to act, but they also can have some, motivations to maybe not do. So maybe they're the highest beta options.
Yeah.
There's certainly people we seek out when we find ourselves in an organization, because if they're open to it, they are a wealth of information, of knowing what happens at each step. And so it's just an interesting, what's just a tip, looking at people who have been around for a while and love their job, and looking at people who are brand new to the organization and have just come from another culture, are really interesting people to interview, because the one who's really deep in it, knows the place really well. But the person who's brand new can see things about the culture that people who are in it don't even recognize anymore. It's like in the ocean that they're swimming in, they don't even notice that it's salty, kind of thing. And then you have this freshwater fish come in and say, oh my God, this place is full of salt. So it's very useful to have both of those juxtaposed together to get to the truth of what's really going on. It's some combination of those perspectives.
It's funny you say that. My best friend just recently transitioned roles in different companies, and he was mentioning that when he was working at his previous company, they were like all transactional all the time, of like, hey, we need this from you, we need that from you. And he was working remotely. Everybody was fully remote. So people only reached out to him when they needed something for him. They never did any icebreakers. They never did any cultural or bond building or anything like that. And he even proposed it. He was like, hey, let's like one Friday, like on Friday, we'll come up with a cool background for our Zoom background. And like he did it, and he had a couple of like direct reports do it, but like his manager and his fellow peers on his level never did it. And he did a one-on-one. He's like, hey, would you be open to doing this? I'm trying to build some culture here. And his colleagues would be like, I'll think about it. And they never did it. Now he's in this new company. He loves it. They do icebreakers. They even though they're totally virtual, they're getting to know each other. And he's like, oh, I can sense that there's a feeling of togetherness and coming together, I guess, with this team that's beyond just the transaction of like, I need you to get this thing done.
Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting how people learn that pretty quickly. You come to a new place and you try, just as your friend did, you try maybe something from your old organization. Oh, this used to work. And you learn very quickly, without even always realizing it consciously, okay, we don't do that here, and these are the elements of culture. Now, are his managers jerks? No, they probably also, like him, maybe they tried something and quickly learned, okay, success here is being really transactional, really efficient. I'm sure it's framed really positively. We don't bother you with FaceTime. We get things done really quickly. And there's a bunch of people who find that appealing. And so there's a cyclical effect there. But again, it's not to be a bad person, but that has been the incentive in that organization, has been driven towards, people, efforts like your friends have been shut down, and efforts to like make things even more streamlined and spend even less time together have been rewarded. And so over time, that's how that place has evolved.
That's it. That's it. That's exactly it. I think that is, I mean, for any leaders that are watching this right now, that is it. Is one's perception and interpretation of the rule will reflect how they react and more or less act within the organizational setting. So you need to be very clear as a leader, and perhaps even remind your team how you want them to act given the incentive structure that you've set up in place.
Yeah. And I think you have to be much more self-aware, and this takes a ton of work. Leaders cast a long shadow. I mean, I've worked at a place where I walked in and there were a bunch of people sitting around a table and they all had a Diet Coke on the table. And I'm a big Diet Coke fan. So I kind of made a joke. I was like, great to see a bunch of Diet Coke drinkers here. And people kind of laughed. And the senior person stepped out for a minute and someone pulled me aside and said, we learned that the senior person doesn't drink coffee, drinks Diet Coke. And so we all started drinking Diet Coke because that's how, we create relationships with this person. And the leader, was dumbfounded. He could not believe that people were drinking Diet Coke because he drank Diet Coke. So people are attending to, especially in a hierarchical system where promotion is what matters, people are attending to even the smallest details sometimes of what you do. And that's not to put pressure on all the leaders, but it's just to say you cast a longer shadow than you think, not just in the incentives you set up, which are structural, but even in your own personal, how you carry yourself. Do you show up right on time and start a meeting at 12:00, or are you always 5 minutes late? If you're always 5 minutes late, within a month, your whole organization is always 5 minutes late. So just being aware of the shadow you cast and trying to take steps to shape it proactively. If that's your choice, great. But what my goal is that the things you're doing consciously and for the good of your team, instead of by accident and not realizing, the unintended consequences.
I love that. I think that is a huge nugget. I think for any leaders, your shadow is a lot longer and is cast a lot further than you realize. I think a lot of leaders think, oh, we got this great, amazing, psychologically safe culture. Everybody feels comfortable sharing their challenges with me. It's like, no, they don't. We are conditioned to respect authority. And if you are in a position of authority, you will be respected. And by respect, I mean not told when there are problems that they disagree with of your opinion or thoughts, and just natural. So we need to be able to be more creative and more self-aware as to when we might be adjusting and altering people's perspective. When we, or maybe they don't put up that much of opposition to us, but even if a little bit means a lot more to them than you probably realize.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure if someday the CEO of that company your friend was working for was told, we have an unfriendly transactional culture, you'd say, oh, I don't think that's true. And then someone said an example of, well, my friend tried to make things lighter and he got shut down. It's, those managers would never even think that they shut him down. We didn't shut that down. He didn't propose he just, he tried it. It didn't have a lot of uptake. This moment of denying when people put themselves out there is so much more powerful to them than it is to you. And that's what it feels like. You have to remember that when he tried that background thing, he was kind of putting himself out there a little bit and he effectively got shut down. How long do you think it's going to be before he tries something like that again? I mean,
He didn't. No, he left.
He left. Exactly. And it's so tiny, right? But it's so big at the same time. And I think those examples are very powerful because those micro examples are what cascade into the entire culture that you have.
Amazing. Well, Diana, thanks for being here. This has been a great lunch and learn. Last question for you. How can our audience learn more about your work? How can they connect with you? Are you a LinkedIner or no? Like how can our audience connect with you and learn more about you?
Absolutely. LinkedIn is the easiest place. I'm Diana Dosik on LinkedIn, easy to find. And if you haven't had a chance to watch the TED Talk, it is a great way to not only hear some of these concepts, but see me 8 months pregnant with my son. So he was on the TED stage with me, which is really fun as well. So yeah, happy to chat with anyone who's interested in connecting with me there.
Amazing. Thanks for being here, Diana. Everybody, thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day.